There's not going to be a peace deal anytime soon. Because, as you said in your intro, Putin's aim is to subdue Ukraine. And that means at a minimum, taking control of the entire east bank of the Dnipro River, which means a whole lot more territory, and taking control of the Ukrainian Black Sea coast and leaving a rump Ukraine somewhere in the west. And otherwise, he will continue the war.
All this talk of peace plans, the US-Russia proposal, Europe's counterplan, and now a revised framework comes as Russia and Ukraine are still trading deadly strikes overnight, killing at least 6 people in Kyiv and leaving homes burning. A stark reminder, if we needed one, of what this war still inflicts daily. Volodymyr Zelensky wants an end, but not at any price. Donald Trump wants a deal, and quickly. He even floated Thanksgiving in America as a deadline. A timeline that was never realistic, but it has injected urgency into the diplomacy. The challenge is simple. Putin is happy to keep fighting until he gets what he wants: Ukraine subdued. That's why these peace talks, however active, come with a hard question. Are these negotiations really shaping towards a fair settlement? Or one, are they towards Moscow because it believes it has the upper hand? Some European amendments may now be in the mix. No automatic veto on future Ukrainian NATO membership. No cap on troop numbers. And possibly the removal of any amnesty for war crimes. But big issues remain unresolved, especially US security guarantees if Russia invades again, a red line for Kyiv. And even if Ukraine could sign something that protects its future, there's no indication the Kremlin is prepared to something. Without that, the war simply continues. So yes, diplomacy is moving, but the real test isn't whether the talks are happening, it's whose interests the final document truly serves, and whether Putin has any intention of signing or honouring it. This is The Times at 1 with Joe Coburn. Addressing the Commons a few moments ago, Keir Starmer has said Ukraine's sovereignty must be maintained and that the UK will never falter in support of Ukraine. We've also learnt this morning, as I've said, that President Zelensky could visit the US in the next few days, as US media reports that Ukraine has agreed to the peace proposal brokered by the Trump administration, with some details still to be worked out. Washington first sent its initial 28-point peace plan to Kyiv last week, before top officials from both countries reportedly drafted a slimmed-down 19-point proposal in Geneva last weekend. But will Russia actually agree to such proposals? Let's speak to John Herbst, former United States ambassador to Ukraine. Welcome to Times at 1. The original plan called for Ukraine to cede land to Russia that was still under its control, barred Kyiv from ever joining NATO, and imposed limits on the size of Ukraine's armed forces. In what specific ways does this new peace plan differ?
Well, from what I've read about in the media, because I haven't seen the actual points, the most egregious elements of the 28-point proposal are gone. And specifically the two you just mentioned, Ukraine ceding land they control, in fact, highly strategic land, which Moscow has failed to conquer despite strenuous efforts since their big invasion began almost 4 years ago. And of course, the cap on the military forces of the victim and no limits on the military forces of the aggressor, also egregious, that's also gone. And, you mentioned the the European position that Russia has no veto rights over Ukraine joining NATO, nor does the United States. So that may also be on its way out. So this draft is far, far better than the draft that we first saw.
Right. And do you accept that it did almost look as if the original plan had been written by Moscow, as the accusation went?
There's a fair amount of evidence for that. But whoever ultimately wrote it, at least lower levels of the U.S. government put their name on it. And Trump sort of, but not in a Trumpian way, kind of approved it. So this was really never his initiative.
I mean, looking ahead to a possible meeting later this week, what progress do you think can realistically be made if Russia and Vladimir Putin at the moment see no reason to sign anything?
There's not going to be a peace deal anytime soon. Because, as you said in your intro, Putin's aim is to subdue Ukraine. And that means at a minimum, taking control of the entire east bank of the Dnipro River, which means a whole lot more territory, and taking control of the Ukrainian Black Sea coast and leaving a rump Ukraine somewhere in the west. And otherwise, he will continue the war. And that, I would say, that a very important point is not completely understood in Washington, at least not by ultimate decision makers.
Right. Well, if it's not understood in Washington, we haven't really progressed very far, have we?
Well, the way I look at it, President Trump did win the majority vote in our election, so he's president. He gets to make the decisions. And his understanding of this issue has moved in the right direction. He was beating up on Zelensky in February and early March. And then he began to talk about Russian obstructionism. And he still talks about that as recently as when he put the major sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil about 3 weeks ago, which, of course, is what prompted Putin to send Dmitriev to talk to Witkoff, which led to the plan, the 28-point plan, which is deeply, deeply flawed.
Yes, although he did, to some extent, blame Zelensky and Ukraine for being the sticking point, certainly over the weekend when that plan was presented.
If you look carefully at Trump's actions and his statements, and I become a Trumpologist, you might say, in the spring, late winter and early spring, when Trump was really slamming Zelensky, he was slamming him with paragraphs on Truth Social and multiple times. This time was basically one sentence. So that wasn't the true Trump treatment. And, others in his government have been driving this policy, Witkoff prominently, but it looks also like Vice President Vance. And I think Trump was willing to let it play out, but it wasn't he didn't take full ownership of it, comparison in the past. And so we've seen him learn to be skeptical about Putin, which is why there was no Budapest summit.
Right. I think, yeah, go on.
I think that the reason why Dmitriev was dispatched to the United States was Putin had some success by directly reaching out to Trump. He had that success in May. He had that success in August when it seemed we were going to put major sanctions on Russia. Putin reached out and averted it. Putin then reached out to Trump just before the last Zelensky visit to Washington in late October. And, Trump was talking about, at that point, major new sanctions on Russia and perhaps tomahawks for Ukraine. Trump stopped talking about that briefly, right? But then within a few days, he put the heavy sanctions on Lukoil and Rosneft. So Putin's ability to manipulate Trump directly was waning. So now he tried it by Dmitriev to Witkoff, and they didn't quite rope Trump in because it was J.D. Vance who picked up the phone to call Zelensky last week.
Right, but what pressure can be brought to bear by Donald Trump on Putin to actually get some sort of agreement, other than just continue fighting?
This is no secret. Putin needs to face massive pressure both on the battlefield and on the economy. So what we would need is not a one-off. Now, the sanctions Trump put on Rosneft and Lukoil was serious, but he said after that something like, we need to calibrate these things. That's actually a tactical error. That's a Biden approach of mild escalation. You want to get Putin to make peace, you have to have a series of punishing steps in terms of more powerful weapons to Ukraine and sanctions on the economy. Because Putin has outlasted every Western statesman and stateswoman since he began his war 11 years ago. He thinks he can outlast Trump. Trump has to persuade him he cannot do that. And that's going to take at least 6 months, and maybe a lot more than 6 months of serious pressure on the Kremlin.
John Herbst, former United States ambassador to Ukraine, thank you very much for talking to us today.